Welcome to Training Signal. You're watching a lesson on configuring group policy objects. In this lesson, we'll see what's going on in the world of global semantics and why we want to use group policy objects. Then we'll see exactly what a GPO or a group policy object is. I'll show you how to use the Group Policy Management Council, or what sometimes is simply referred to as the GPMC. I also want to mention, by the way, that it is sometimes referred to as the GPMT, which is the Group Policy Management Tool. So if you see it referred to by either of those acronyms, it's the same utility. I'll show you how to create a GPO. I'll show you how to do something called link a GPO. We're going to talk about a term called LSDOU, which is a term that represents the order of application and inheritance of group policy objects. And then we're going to go ahead and implement a policy and test it to see exactly what effect that policy had on a particular user or computer. So first of all, what's going on in the world of global semantics? Well, they've decided that they need to have better control over the desktop environment for their users. They want to make sure that their users are not accessing or installing components on their local computers if they're not pertinent to their job function. Likewise, they also want to make sure that the users have all the resources necessary to do their jobs readily available to them. So in this lesson, we are going to see how group policy can be used to control the user's work environment. Now, before we go any further into this, I really want to talk to you about this word control. Okay? It's listed twice here, at the beginning and at the end, where we want to have control over the user's desktop environment. When an IT administrator hears the word control, they tend to think about locking things down. Okay? And yes, we are talking here about how we want to make sure that users are not able to access or install certain things. Okay? That's the form of control that involves locking things down. But another form of control is making things readily available. If you know that you have users who are going to have certain needs, so they do need to access certain utilities or possibly certain resources, well, then you want to make those utilities and resources right out there in the open where those users can easily find them. And that's another form of control. And honestly, that can be an even better form of control than just locking things down. So in this lesson, we're going to look at the whole big picture of how we want to go ahead and set up a user's environment. So what is this thing that we're referring to, this GPO? Well, GPO, as is in the title of this lesson, stands for Group Policy Object. But what is a group policy object? Well, it's a collection of settings that define what a system will look like and how it will behave for a defined group of users or computers. Okay, so basically what is a GPO? It's a bunch of settings that you can push down to users or computers. And by taking these settings and pushing them down to users or computers, you help control the environment in which they are working within. GPOs are managed with the Group Policy Management Council. And again, as I mentioned a moment ago, sometimes referred to as the Group Policy Management Tool. I'll show you when we get into the operating system why it can be referred to by both names. GPOs can be linked. Okay, I mentioned that I'm going to show you how to link a GPO. Well, GPOs can be linked to Active Directory containers. Okay, so once we have a bunch of settings, we then link that group of settings to a container, and then it will affect all of the users and or computers in that container. Okay, and that's the last thing I have here, is that GPO settings can be applied to either computers and or users. Okay, and when we get in here and take a look at an actual GPO, you will see how there is a computer section and there is a user section. Now at this point, there's probably no better way to help you to understand what it is that I'm talking about than to just take you right into the operating system and take a look at what these group policy objects look like. So let's go do that now. All right, so here we are on our Windows 7 client in the Global Mantix network, and I'm going to show you a couple different ways that we could manage group policy. Now the first way would be to do it from a domain controller. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and connect to New York DC1. Just do a remote desktop connection into New York DC1, so it's as though we were on the server. And on that server, if I click Start and go to Administrative Tools, you will see here Group Policy Management. Now I had mentioned that it was called the Group Policy Management Council. That was actually the former name. Microsoft has since dropped the name Council, and that's one of the reasons why you don't necessarily see it referred to as GPMC anymore. But let me go ahead and open up this utility just so you can see what it looks like. Go ahead and maximize it here. Here we have Group Policy Management, and here you'll see our forest, globalmantix.local. Expand this, and you'll see that we have our domains within the forest, which there's just the one, globalmantix.local. And we have sites, which for the moment, well, we don't have any sites that we've set up. That's something that we're going to do later on in this course. Down here we have group policy modeling and group policy results, which are a way of testing and troubleshooting the implementation of group policy. So we're actually going to look at that later on in this lesson. But if I go up here to globalmantix.local and expand it, and go ahead, let me move this over just a little bit so we can see everything. There we go. You'll see that in the domain, we have one policy that's already in place called the default domain policy. When I click on it, or any other policy, when you click on it for the first time, it'll say that you have selected a link to a GPO. Except for changes to link properties, changes you make here are global to the GPO and will impact other locations where the GPO is linked. Now, this is a very confusing message to you right now, since I haven't really explained how GPO links work yet. But basically, this is a GPO that has been linked to the domain, because the domain is a container, and that's where it's been linked. And what it's saying is, if you make changes, you're going to be making it to all places where this GPO is linked. Now again, confusing right now. I will explain it before we're done. What I want to do is I want to say, don't bother me with this message anymore. If I don't check that box, this message is going to come up every time I click on any link of any group policy object. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK, and I'll revisit that message, or what that message was trying to say, once I explain how GPOs and links and all that stuff works. What I want to show you is that you can also see a couple of containers. We have the domain controllers container and the New York container. Now, if we were to, real quick here, let me click on Start and go up to Active Directory Users and Computers. I just want you to notice that in the globalmantix.local domain, there's more than just those two containers, right? We have built-in computers, domain controllers, foreign security principles, managed service accounts, New York, and users. But you'll notice that all of these containers are built-in containers. They're not actually considered to be organizational units, except for domain controllers and New York. Okay, and you can tell that by the little icon being different. Okay, these are the only two organizational units. And as I had mentioned in a previous lesson, one of the significances of an organizational unit versus a built-in container is that you can link group policies to it. Okay, so let me go ahead and close Active Directory Users and Computers, bring us back to the Group Policy Management utility, where you'll see the two organizational units, domain controllers and New York. If I expand domain controllers, you'll see that there is another group policy that has been created, and it's there by default, thus the name, Default Domain Controllers Policy. Okay, again, I have to move this over just a little bit. There we go. Default Domain Controllers Policy. If I expand New York, well, I don't see any group policies linked inside New York, but I see other organizational units, New York computers, groups, and users. If I expand New York computers, you see clients and member servers. If I just keep expanding, you'll notice those don't expand anything. Groups, same thing. Users, same thing. Okay, so we're fully expanded out here in the domain structure. And the reason we don't see anything else is because there are not any group policies currently linked to any of these containers. By default, before you do anything, by just installing the operating system and installing Active Directory, there are two group policy objects, one called default domain policy, one called default domain controllers policy, and they are linked by default to the domain, at least with the default domain policy, and the domain controllers organizational unit with the default domain controllers policy. But if we get away from the whole hierarchy here, and we come down here to a container called group policy objects, this is where, and actually I could have expanded it or clicked on it either way. If I expand it, I see them down here. If I click on it, I see them over here. This is where we store all of the group policy objects within this domain. Okay, and down here is truthfully where you should be editing group policy objects and where you should be creating group policy objects. That is why there was a message letting me know that when I clicked up here on this default domain policy, that this is actually, and there's a little icon for it here, a little arrow. It's almost like the little shortcut arrow that we see on icons, saying that this is a link. But down here is the actual policy. We can edit it from either place. It's just good practice to make edits from the actual policy as opposed to the link, just because there's a tendency sometimes to come up here to the link and make changes here, not really realizing, oh, there could be other places that I could be affecting. Now, how is that happening? You might be thinking to yourself, well, wait a minute. I'm not affecting it anywhere else. It's not linked anywhere else. Well, I'm going to kind of skip ahead here, and I'm going to show you that I could take this default domain policy, and it can be linked to other containers. Okay, if I right-click, let's say, on New York, and I say link an existing GPO, I can go ahead and say default domain policy, click OK. Well, look at that. Now, this one policy is linked to these two different locations. These two different containers really would be the proper way of saying that. Okay, and what that means is the settings within this default domain policy are now going to affect users and or computers in the domain because it's linked to that container. And it's also going to have an effect on users and or computers in the New York OU because it's linked in that container. Now, if you're confused right now, don't worry. I promise this is all coming together because what I've just done makes no sense. Right? If it's affecting all the users and computers in the domain, well, then of course it's already affecting everybody in New York. So why would I do that? And as a matter of fact, I wouldn't do that. So let me go ahead and right click and delete. Now, I'm not actually deleting the GPO. I'm just deleting the link. It says right here, do you want to delete this link? It will not delete the actual GPO. So I'll click OK. I do want to do that. That was just to show you that you could link it. But before I go any further at all, I said that I was going to show you different ways to manage group policy. So I'm going to go ahead and close the Group Policy Management Console or tool, however you want to look at it. And then I'm going to go ahead and close out of my connection with New York DC1. Let me go ahead and close that. Click OK. Then I'm disconnecting a session. Back here on our Windows 7 client, you may recall that we previously installed the remote server administration tools. Right? So if I go ahead and just come down to Start and go to my administrative tools, remember, we can go to things like Active Directory, users and computers, sites and services, domains and trusts. But, well, I don't see the Group Policy Management Console here. So what we need to do is we need to go to the Control Panel, go to Programs, turn Windows Features on or off. It'll take just a moment here. It's fairly quick. It needs to look at what's currently installed. Here we'll see the Remote Server Administration Tools. I'm going to expand that. And the reason there's no Group Policy Management Console there is because that is, believe it or not, a feature. It's not a role. Okay, we went ahead and added the Role Administration Tools. We're going to go ahead and now add the Feature Administration Tools. So I'm going to expand this. And here you'll see Group Policy Management. Oh, look, there's that word. Tools. Group Policy Management Tools. That's why some people now call it the GPMT. But anyway, let me go ahead and click the checkbox there and click OK. And you'll see here it's going to ask us to wait just a moment. It says it could be several minutes because it's going to go through and it's going to install this Group Policy Management, well, whatever you want to call it, tool or console. Why don't we just call it the GPM, Group Policy Management, and be done with it, right? Anyway, this will take just another moment and it will be installed. And there we go. And now, let me go ahead and close out of the Control Panel. What should happen is if I click on Start and go to my Administrative Tools, hey, look at that. Now I have Group Policy Management. If I click on that, straight from the client, it has the ability to go ahead and say, well, I'm part of the globalmantics.local forest, so let's go ahead and expand that. Domains, globalmantics.local. Expand that. Let me go ahead and move this over just like we did on the other screen. And you'll see that we have all the same stuff. Okay, just kind of expanding this out so it looks very similar to what we were looking at. Matter of fact, it's not similar. It's identical to what we were looking at on our Windows Server 2008 domain controller. Okay, so this is the other way that we can manage group policies using the Remote Server Administration Tools. So now that we are in here, let me go ahead and take us a little step further, and I'm going to go ahead and click on this default domain policy. Oh, look at that. We're getting our message again. Why? Because we're on a different computer. And so on this computer, it's going to go ahead and give us this little warning until we check this box. Now let me not check the box here and click OK. Let me show you if I come down here to Group Policy Objects, click on the default domain policy here, I don't get that little message. Okay, that message is only if you click on a link. Okay, if I click up here on the link, that's when I see the message. Now I'm going to check this box because I'm going to be probably clicking on links to policies throughout the rest of this lesson and future lessons, and I don't want to be bothered with it. I know what I'm doing. I understand what the ramifications are of modifying a GPO on a link. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And I'm going to right click, whether it be the link or down here, it doesn't really matter. And I'm going to select Edit. Now if I go ahead and expand this here, you'll see that Edit takes me into the Group Policy Management Editor. And as I mentioned earlier, there are two sections. There is the Computer Configuration section and the User Configuration section. Inside each section, you'll see that there are policies and preferences. Now, the policies are what we're talking about right now. Preferences is something we'll talk about in an upcoming lesson. But if I expand policies under either computer or user, you'll see here that we have software settings, which we're going to look at again later because that has to do specifically with deploying software with group policy. We have Windows settings, which is a little bit different for computers than it is for users. So you'll see under computer configuration, we have some Windows settings, whereas under user configuration, it's kind of similar, but everything's not exactly the same. There's some slight differences. Let me go ahead and put that back up because we're not going to look at those right now, but I do want to show you administrative templates. I'll go ahead and expand this over here. You'll see there's a lot of lengthy explanation of exactly what this is. Administrative templates, policy definitions, ADMX files retrieved from the local machine. We're not going to worry about that right now. I just want to show you what those words were in case you're wondering. We're just going to move this over here to administrative templates. Okay? Inside the administrative templates is where we will find literally hundreds, if not thousands, of different settings that can control the environment for specific computers or users that log into those computers. So as for instance, under user configuration, here we have control panel. If I just click on that, over here on the right, you will see that there are some settings that are direct to the control panel, and then there are some settings that are specific to certain applets within the control panel. So here, as a for instance, let's go right into prohibit access to the control panel. When I click on that, over here on the left, we'll see an explanation. What does this setting do? Well, first of all, it tells us that we need to be using at least Windows 2000. Okay, so as far as the client goes, the client must be at least Windows 2000 or newer. So this setting is going to affect pretty much every client there's been since group policy was originally implemented. What does it do? As far as the description, disables all control panel programs. And then it goes on to a more detailed, how does it accomplish that? Okay, by actually preventing the control.exe, which is the executable, which is the program for control panel, etc., etc. Now I want to show you something. I'm going to go ahead and change from the extended tab, which we're on right now, to the standard tab. What that does is it eliminates that explanation. I don't want to have that explanation on the screen, at least not right now. And I will tell you, most of the machines that I administrate, I don't bother with that particular explanation being on the screen there, because I want to have as much viewing space as possible, because as we dig down into stuff, you'll see that there are some long lists of settings, and some of these settings can get quite lengthy. I want this whole window. Okay, and then just to show you, by the way, if I were to go ahead and dig down here, you'll see that we really have a lot of settings. So I'm not even going to continue with the Windows components, expanding this down. And then inside each one of these, sometimes you have a shorter list and sometimes you have longer lists. Okay, I'm just clicking through each one of these. Again, some of these have long lists, some of these have shorter lists. Okay, but anyway, let me go ahead and come back up here to control panel, because I want to show you that if I double click on this guy right here, prohibit access to control panel, here is where you already get the explanation that I just eliminated from the main screen. That's why I don't want to have the explanation there. I want to have the screen space, and if I really want to see the explanation, I'll just double click and I'll see what operating system is supported and the explanation. Now, there is no right way to do this or wrong way to do this. It's personal preference. My personal preference is to have it not there. Now, the next thing I want to show you is these three settings right here: not configured, enabled, or disabled. Not configured means that this setting is not configured in this group policy and therefore will have no effect on any user or computer that is in a container that this group policy object is linked to. So as far as whether a user would have access to the control panel would be determined based upon any other policy that may be affecting that user. Okay, which what's going to come down to would be the default local policy on the individual computer is going to go ahead and say that obviously the control panel is on by default, unless somebody has made a change to that policy and or has come in and created a group policy. Okay, so not configured means basically I'm not touching the setting, leave it alone. If they already have access, let them keep access. If they've been denied access by some other policy, well, leave it denied. Then we have enabled, which means, well, just that. It means we're going to enable this policy, which means we are prohibiting access to the control panel for any user that's in a container that this GPO is linked to. If I select disabled, now this is where it gets a little confusing for some people. This is where we are explicitly saying don't prohibit access to the control panel. So any user that is in a container that has this GPO linked to it, would then specifically be given access to the control panel, even if it was previously taken away. Okay, so that's the difference between not configured and disabled. See, a lot of people think of it as, well, wait a minute, if it's not configured, by default, they have access to the control panel. If we disable this setting, we're not prohibiting access to the control panel, which means it's like a double negative, meaning we're allowing access to the control panel. What's the difference? The top one means I don't care whether you have access or not. It has to do with other settings from other policies. Disabled means I do care. I want you to specifically have access to the control panel. And then enabled would mean I specifically don't want you to have access to the control panel. Now I'm going to go ahead and hit cancel because we're not looking to implement anything right now. I just wanted to show you that that's how most group policy object settings are done. Okay, or at least most of these administrative template based settings are controlled by going into the setting and either leaving it as not configured, enabled, or disabled. Now some settings, like here we have hide specified control panel items. Here, if we enable this setting, well, now I have to make a list of the disallowed control panel items. Okay, so some settings, they will have more than just not configured, enabled, or disabled. We then take it a step further, and because this particular setting is saying hide certain specified control panel items, well, I have to then specify what those control panel items are. So I could go into here and enter the control panel items that we don't want to show. Now again, I'm going to go ahead and cancel out of here because I'm not looking to actually set anything right now. I just wanted to show you this is what the interface looks like when you're going through and editing a group policy object. So let me go ahead and close out of the group policy management editor, which, by the way, if I made any changes, those changes are implemented automatically. And what I mean by that is, let me go back into the editor. And let's go ahead and go into policies, administrative templates, control panel. Let me go ahead and let me click on standard again. it automatically defaulted back to extended. Let me go ahead into this prohibit access to the control panel, and I'm going to actually select disabled. Okay, so you can see here it says it's disabled. If I close this window, notice it doesn't say, would you like to save changes? When you make changes using the group policy management editor, those changes are implemented automatically. You are not prompted to save those changes. Okay, so let's go back in here, edit. Let's go back in here to our control panel. Not configured. Click OK. Close. All right. So now I've undone the changes that I just did. So just want to point out that you want to be just a little bit careful when it comes to the group policy editing. But what I'd like to show you now is how to actually create a GPO, right? We've kind of seen that there are two that are created for us, the default domain policy and default domain controllers policy. Showed you how to go in and basically edit an existing policy. But what about creating a policy? Well, there's a few different ways that we can create a policy. One way is to come down here to our group policy objects container, right click, and just select new. And we have a new group policy object. So we're just going to call this demo policy. Okay, so we're not going to worry about what this policy is. I just want to show you how to do this right now. And you'll notice right here it says source starter GPO. And there's none to choose from. So I'm going to come back and show you what that is in just a moment. But right now I'm just going to create one called demo policy. And I click OK. And that's it. That's all there is to creating a new GPO. Once I've created it, what could I then do? I could come over here to a container, right click, and say link existing GPO, demo policy, click OK. Now it's been linked. Or maybe we would go in and edit the settings to put them the way we want them and then link it. Or guess what else we could do? We could right click on a container, and instead of linking an existing GPO, look what the choice right above it is. Create a GPO in this domain and link it here. So we can create and link GPOs in one shot. So if I select that one, and we'll call this one Demo 2 Policy, click OK. Look at that. We see the link of it up here on the container where I had selected to do this, but also down here under our group policy objects. There is no one right or wrong way when it comes to creating and linking GPOs. You can either create the GPO first and not have it linked to anywhere. Many people might say that that is the recommended way. That way you can set up all your settings before you link it anywhere. Or some people will tell you that's just a wasted step, and I know that I'm creating a GPO and it's meant specifically for the New York users container, so let's just go ahead and create it and link it right there. Now, when we went to create the new group policy object, it asked us about the starter GPO, and that's down here. See, here we have our starter GPOs. Starter GPOs are basically just a way of creating a template that you may want to start with. So maybe there's a lot of GPOs that you may want to create throughout your domain, and you want them all to have certain settings. Now, personally, I'm not a big fan of this. Okay? I'm not necessarily against it either. Again, it kind of comes down to personal preference. I'm not a big fan of this. If there are settings that you want to have applied throughout the domain, regardless of any other settings that you may have in your GPOs, well, my opinion is you go ahead and you put it up in a policy that's linked to the domain. And in a few minutes here, I'm going to show you exactly what happens when you have GPOs linked to multiple containers throughout the domain structure. But basically, if there are a certain group of settings that I want to have by default on all my GPOs in the domain, well, then I'm going to go ahead and link it to the domain. But another way you could do it is by going ahead and creating a starter GPOs folder. Go ahead and click on that there. And here you'll see there are a group of built-in starter GPOs that Microsoft has been so kind as to put there for you, which you'll notice you have Windows XP Service Pack 2 and you have Windows Vista. You can tell that they've created these a while ago because there's no Windows 7 starter GPOs, and you'll notice this is XP Service Pack 2 as opposed to, I can tell you as of the time that I'm making this lesson, we're already at Service Pack 3 and Vista is already at Service Pack 1. But I will tell you that you can go out on the internet and you can get some of these starter GPOs from Microsoft for the newer versions of the operating system. But I just wanted to show you that here they are, and if I come over here and expand group policy objects, right click, new, now when I pull this down, I can use a starter GPO, which just means it's a starter group of settings. Now in a little bit, we'll look at how we can go in and actually see what these settings are. But for right now, I just wanted to tell you the idea here behind it, the idea behind these starter GPOs. They're like templates. All right, so basically, what have we done up to this point? Well, we've seen how we can, look at our domain's hierarchy and see where we have different GPOs linked. We also have our group policy objects container here, which is all of the group policy objects for the domain. I've shown you how to actually create a GPO by either creating it down here in this container or by creating it and linking it simultaneously. And then speaking of linking it, we can also go ahead and right click on a container and link an existing GPO that's been previously created to that container. Now, before we go any deeper into any of this, I want to take us out of the operating system for just a moment here, and I want to talk to you about exactly how these group policy objects are applied through the domain hierarchy. So when it comes to group policy application and inheritance, I told you that that was represented by a term called LSDOU. Okay, and actually LSDOU, although it sounds like I'm actually saying a word the way I'm saying it, it really is just the letters L, S, D, and then OU. And what do these letters stand for? Well, L stands for local. Every computer has its own individual local policy. Okay, and some people even call it the local group policy. Either way, it doesn't matter. The bottom line is that it is an actual policy that is local to the individual computer. The S stands for site. A site is a container within the Active Directory infrastructure that we can link a GPO to. Okay, so we're not going to look at that in this lesson because we don't have any sites created yet. We haven't really talked about what sites are in the Active Directory infrastructure. Other than generically, I will mention that sites are locations. Okay, just real generically, a site is an Active Directory container object that represents a physical location for your organization. Well, you can link group policy objects to a site and therefore have the settings apply to all users and or computers within that location. The D stands for domain. We've already seen that, where we can link a group policy object to a domain and then affect all the users and or computers within that domain. And then of course OU stands for organizational unit. And as we saw, we can link group policy objects to an organizational unit. And I will tell you that not only are we not going to talk about linking group policy objects to sites in this lesson, I will also tell you that it is good practice to link group policy objects to sites sparingly. Interesting things can happen when it comes to replication and the access of a group policy object when it is linked to a site. Okay, and it has a lot to do with the fact that different locations means you're going over slow WAN links and things like that. Now, I'm not going to get into any great detail here. We'll save that for when we talk about sites. But basically, I will tell you that it's good common practice to not link group policy objects to sites. Now, the flip side of that is that it is very good practice to primarily use your organizational units for the purposes of linking group policy objects. Okay, now it's not to say that there's anything wrong with linking a group policy object to the domain. It's just that you have much better control over exactly who or what group policy object is going to affect by doing it at the more granular level down at the organizational unit level, as opposed to just creating a bunch of settings and saying, boom, everybody in the domain, you get these settings. Okay, that's kind of the cheap, easy way out. I'm just going to set these settings and they'll just go ahead and link to a domain and it's for everybody. Okay? Now, the next thing I want to tell you is besides L, S, D, and OU, standing for local, site, domain, and organizational unit, is that this is the actual order of application and inheritance. What this means is when a user logs on, as a for instance, the local policy will be looked at to see what settings this user should have. After those settings have applied, it will then look to see, based upon what site the computer is in, if there are any group policy objects linked to that site, and if there are any user-based settings on that group policy object, and if so, it will then apply those. When that is done, it then looks to the domain that the user is in and looks to see if there's any group policy objects linked to that domain, if there are any user-based settings, and if so, go ahead and apply those. And then it looks to see what organizational unit the user resides in. Okay, so the actual user object in Active Directory, where is that user object? What organizational unit is that user object in? And are there any GPOs linked to that container? And if so, apply them. And technically, LSDOU is LSDOU, OU, 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 etc., etc. And the reason for that is because let's say that the user was in an organizational unit that was actually a child OU of another organizational unit, and that is a child OU of another organizational unit. Well, what's going to end up happening then is when the user logs in, the local policy will be applied, then the site policy, if there is one, will be applied, then the domain policy, if there is one, will be applied, then the top level parent organizational unit will be applied, if there's any GPOs that are linked to it. Then it will go down through the hierarchy. It will go down to the next OU in the hierarchy and see if there's any GPO settings to apply there, then go down finally to the actual OU that the user account is in. Now, this same process will take place for computers. The only difference is users will have this process take place when they log in. Computers will have this process take place when they are turned on. But it's the same process. There's a local policy, then it looks to the site, then it looks to the domain, and then it looks to the OU, and if necessary, down through the hierarchy of OUs until it gets to the actual computer object. Now, why is this significant? Well, the reason it's significant is it has to do with what happens when you have conflicting settings. Let's say there is a policy that is linked to the domain that says prohibit access to the control panel, and it's been enabled. And a user logs in who's in that domain. Well, the local policy will kick in first, and that local policy will say, yeah, the user can have access to the control panel. But then the site will be looked at, and we'll say that there's no GPO linked to the site, so nothing happens there. Then the domain is looked at, and there's a GPO that says prohibit access to the control panel. Well, now that user has been prohibited access to the control panel, meaning it's like a switch has been flipped. The local policy flipped the switch and said, hey, control panel's on. You can see it. And the domain says, nope, flip that switch. The control panel is off. You cannot get to it. Aha, but what if the user's in an organizational unit that has a GPO linked to it, and that GPO says that you do have access to the control panel, right? We've disabled the prohibiting of access to the control panel. Aha, see, there was a reason I showed you that. Well, that's like saying, okay, we flipped it back on. You can have access to the control panel. The setting that wins is whatever the last setting that is applied. And because it's the last setting that's applied, well, then it matters what the order of application is. Okay, so as we go down through LSDOU, OU, we are flipping all these switches on and off. And however they are left at the end, when we've gone through this entire hierarchy, that's what the end result settings will be. Now, if you have non-conflicting settings, so let's say at the domain level, we've prohibited access to the control panel, and at the OU level, let's say we have prohibited the ability to modify display settings. Okay, I'm just picking stuff at random here. because they don't conflict with one another. One has to do with the control panel, one has to do specifically with the display settings. Both will be in effect. So it's not that one group policy wins completely over another group policy. It's that the individual settings might win if there is a conflicting setting. Now again, this might be just a little bit confusing right now until you actually go in and play with it and see it. Now I'm going to show you a little bit of that in this lesson, but I will also tell you that in the next lesson, we're going to talk about ways of altering this default LSDOU application and inheritance. So let me take you back over into the operating system and let's go ahead and create an actual policy that has an actual effect on our system. And then let's look and see how the system was actually affected. All right, so we're back here on our Windows 7 client. We still have the Group Policy Management utility open. And what I want to do first is I want to go ahead and right-click on these two policies right here. So we'll take Demo Policy and delete it. And you'll see here it says, do you want to delete this GPO and all links to this domain? It will not delete links in other domains, which is kind of weird because we don't have any other domains. But if we did, this is saying, hey, look, it's going to take care of everything within this domain, but if you have a copy of this over another domain, it's still good over there. So I'm going to go ahead and say, yep, I want to get rid of it. And then here we have the other one. Let me go ahead and delete this one. Yep, I want to get rid of that. And the reason I wanted to get rid of those is because those are not actually doing anything. I just created those for the purposes of showing you how to create a policy. What I want to do now is create an actual policy that does something. Okay, so why don't we go ahead and do New York users. Okay, we're going to take our New York users container and we're going to say that for all the users in New York, we don't want them to have access to the control panel. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and right click and say create a GPO in this domain and link it here. And we're going to call this disable control panel. Okay. It's always a good idea to appropriately name your GPOs. And there are two different methods when it comes to naming GPOs. One method is to state what the GPO does. Okay, so and that's the example I did here. This is probably the recommended way where we're going to go ahead and actually disable the control panel. So let's name it that. But another thought process when it comes to naming your GPOs has to do with naming the GPO based upon who or what it is affecting. Okay, so I might actually create a GPO that says settings for New York users. The problem with using a GPO like that just says settings for New York users is that, well, first of all, you're going with the logic that you're just going to use a single GPO that's going to have all settings for all New York users. And the reality is that you probably would have multiple GPOs that you would want to have affecting the New York users. And the reason why is because it's a good idea to have GPOs have settings that are common as opposed to just being all over the place. Now, I'm going to get into that, and I'm going to show you those actual settings in just a little bit, or at least how to view those settings in just a little bit. But I'm just telling you good common practice. There is no one steadfast rule that you have to follow. It's just good practice. The other thing about creating a GPO like this that says disable control panel is now I can use this GPO in multiple places. Okay, I might link this to my New York users, and then I may also link it to other containers once our Active Directory infrastructure grows. There may be other groups of users that are in a container, and I want to go ahead and disable the control panel for all of them. Okay, no problem. Go to my GPO for disable control panel and just link it to that container. All right, so now let's go in and actually set the setting. So I'm going to right click on disable control panel, select edit, Takes me into my group policy management editor. Under user configuration, policies, administrative templates, control panel, over here we have prohibit access to control panel. Double click on it, enable it. Click OK. And I'll change this to standard, and you'll see that it has been enabled. Close it. That's it. I've created a group policy object, and that group policy object is going to affect all users in this container. Now, if you're curious about those users, just go ahead and click Start and go to Active Directory Users and Computers. Go down to New York, go to New York Users. Oh, look at that. Remember, we have a long list of users who all are going to be affected by this group policy object. Now I'm going to go ahead and minimize Active Directory. I want to bring you back over here to the group policy management utility, because one thing I said I was going to show you is I was going to show you how to view the settings. Now, if you go back in time, just to give you a small history lesson here. If you go back to Windows 2000, the only way that we had to view the settings on a specific group policy object would be to go in and edit the object and start digging down through and literally just looking to see anything that was configured. Could you imagine how hard that would be? I mean, again, remember, if I'm trying to dig down here and I'm just clicking, and I'm trying to find something that doesn't say not configured, that could be some real trouble. And that's why it was a very, very, very good practice back then to go ahead and name your group policy object based upon what it did, because otherwise other administrators who would look at it later would be lost. They just wouldn't know what they were looking for. They just have to dig and dig. Well, now with the Group Policy Management Console, we can click on a group policy object, and then over on the right, there's a tab here for Settings. And you'll see here when I click on it, it says it's generating a report. And then here you'll see under Computer Configuration, no settings are defined. Under User Configuration, under Policies, Administrative Templates, let me click on Show. Here it's telling you Control Panel, Show, Prohibit access to the control panel is enabled. Okay, so I have the ability to see exactly what settings are being set without going into the editor and having to dig through and look for them. Now if I come up here to the default domain policy and go to Settings, and then I'm going to click on Show All, you'll see that there are a number of settings that are in place for the default domain policy. Okay, here's things like password account policies, password policy, account lockout policy, things like that. Now those are policies that we're going to look at later on. And by the way, the reason I keep saying, hey, this is something I'm going to show you later, this is something I'm going to show you later, is there's so much when it comes to group policy and understanding every aspect of it that I've actually divided all of this information into 4 or 5 different lessons to hopefully make it a little bit more palatable to your brain. Okay? I don't want to cram it all down your throat in one big, long, 6-hour lesson or however long it would take. I wanted to go ahead and break this up. So I apologize that there are a lot of these things that I'm kind of starting to show you and then I don't get all the way into it, but I promise you, once we're done with all the various group policy lessons, you should fully understand all of this. Now, there's one last thing I want to do in this lesson before we wrap things up, and that is to test what happens with New York users with this GPO in place saying that we're going to disable the control panel. Now, there are a few different ways to test this. One way to test it is right down here with a very neat little tool that Microsoft created called the Group Policy Modeling Utility. Group policy modeling is what allows us to basically do a what-if scenario. Okay, this is what allows us to say, what if a certain user was to log on to a certain computer? What would be the result? And the reason this is super cool is because in the old days, again, kind of going back to the history lesson, back in Windows 2000, we used to basically have to implement and then tell users, okay, it's all set, go ahead, and then we'd have to wait and see. We'd have to wait and see if things worked appropriately, wait and see if people had things they weren't supposed to have, wait and see if phone calls started coming in like crazy from users saying, where's my blah, blah, blah that I'm supposed to have? It's not there. That's how we used to do it. Now we can do the what if statement before the users ever actually log in and see what happens to them. So let me pop back over here to Active Directory for just a minute. And let's go ahead and just take Alma Blanchard. We'll just take right at the top of the list here. And let's see what happens when Alma logs in. And again, this is going to be from a theoretical, what if point of view. We're not actually logging in anywhere. So I'm going to right click on Group Policy Modeling and go to the Group Policy Modeling wizard. This is just a welcome screen. Click Next. Here it's asking which domain controller is Alma, or actually we don't even know what user yet. It's just asking which domain controller would a user be authenticating with. Generally what you want to do here is say any available domain controller running Windows Server 2003 or later. Okay, as opposed to saying specifically if they log into one versus the other. And the reason for this kind of has to do with looking to see if things are truly replicating to all domain controllers. That would be a rare circumstance that you would want to look at and pick a specific domain controller. So usually you say any available domain controller. Next. Now it's saying, all right, so let's see what happens when, now we could say if a user from the New York users container logs in, but I want to make this very specific. I want to know very, very specifically. I'm going to click on Browse, and I'm going to put in Alma. Actually, I have to put in A. Blanchard. Check names. There we go. And it finds that user. Click OK. Logs on to what computer? So I'm going to go ahead and say Computer, Browse. I'm going to go to Advanced and say Find Now. And it just shows me all the various computers. So we're going to go ahead and select New York Client 1. Okay. So now what we're doing is we're saying, what's going to happen when Alma Blanchard logs on to New York Client 1? Now at this point, we could skip to the final page without collecting any additional information. That's what we're basically going to do, but I'll just real quickly show you that there is other stuff you can put in. We can talk about slow network connection. So if this is over, what if it turns out that Alma's logging in over a slow WAN link? We can talk about loopback processing, which is something that comes up in a later lesson. We can emulate what if this user or computer was moved to a different container. We can say what if the user was a member of certain security groups. And I'm going to just at this point say kind of et cetera, because there's a bunch of stuff. I'm going to click to skip to the final page because for right now, we just generically want to say the way things stand right now without monkeying around with containers or security groups and stuff like that. What happens when Alma logs into this computer? So I'm going to click Next, Next, and Finish. And it generates a report. And I'm going to click on Settings, Show All. And then here it's going to show me all the different settings of what's going to happen when Alma logs on to New York Client 1. Not only does it show the setting that's going to be implemented, but it shows you, and it calls it the winning GPO. The winning GPO has to do with the whole LSDOU process. And where it's showing me that the default domain policy is what's going to affect all of these settings all the way down until we get down to here, which is under user configuration. Prohibit access to control panel will be enabled, and it's because of a GPO called disable control panel. Well, that's what we wanted to see happen, right? And you may be thinking to yourself, well, wait a minute. That was kind of ridiculous, Ed. You created a GPO saying disable the control panel, and sure enough, that's what's happening. I will tell you that as ridiculous as that might seem here, in the real world, there are many times that you will create a GPO as simple as what I just did, but yet some way, somehow, those settings don't apply. And very often it'll come down to things like the winning GPO being from some other container that you didn't realize. Now this will make a lot more sense when we get into the next lesson where we talk about altering the default LSDOU application and inheritance, okay? But I'm telling you, this is a very handy utility. So that's one way of testing to see what the results will be when Alma logs in. Now another way of testing it would be the obvious way, which would be to actually go over to a client computer and log in, have the user log in, right? Well, we're going to do that, but not yet. And the reason why is because I want to mention to you this tool right here, Group Policy Results. When it comes to Group Policy Results, it's a similar type situation to what we had with Group Policy Modeling, except for instead of it being a what if scenario, now it's what did happen. Okay, so if I right click and go to the Group Policy Results wizard, next, it's going to ask me what computer. So we're going to say, actually I could have said this computer because this computer is New York Client 1. That's the computer I'm on right now. And you'll see here that I only have 2 choices of users to pick from. Okay, I can only pick from the 2 users who have logged into this computer ever, which is the local administrator who logged in way back in the beginning when we first built the machine, and the Global Mantics administrator. That's all we've logged in as. Okay, so this is the what did actually happen. Okay, so if we say the Global Mantics administrator, let me select a specific user. Next. Now what it's going to do is it's going to create a report. Click Finish. Show All. Well, actually click on Settings and Show All. This is showing me what actually took place the last time the administrator, or the Global Mantics administrator to be specific, logged into this computer. And the reason I scrolled down to the bottom is I want you to notice no settings defined here under user configuration. You'll see there's no sign of the disable control panel group policy object, and that's actually for 2 reasons. One, well, because that object was not in effect the last time I logged in, but 2 would be that the Global Mantics administrator account is not in the New York users container. But even if I did put that user into that container, this report would look exactly the same because it has to do with what happened the last time this user logged in. Okay, so that's Group Policy Modeling and Group Policy Results. What I want to do now is go ahead and close my Group Policy Management utility and close Active Directory Users and Computers and go ahead and log off. So we're going to go ahead and log off the administrator, and we're going to test this. We're going to go ahead and press Control-Alt-Delete, and we're not going to log in as the Global Mantics administrator. We're going to switch user and log in as A. Blanchard. And it's going ahead and telling me that the user's password must be changed before logging on for the first time. Okay, you may remember that when we created all these user accounts, we said password must be changed at first login. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK and go ahead and put in a new password here. All right, and it's going to change the password. It's been changed. Click OK. And now Alma is being logged into this computer. And what should happen as part of this process right now, where you see it preparing the desktop, there's a couple things. One, it's the first time Alma's logging in, so it's creating a user profile. But the second thing that's also going to take place here as part of this logon is it's going to go through the LSDOU process and look at all the different policies and, well, see what settings should be in place. So now that we have a desktop, I'm going to go ahead and click Start. And Wait a minute. Where's the control panel? Can't even see it. It's just gone. Okay, control.exe, it's gone. Matter of fact, let's try actually typing in control.exe. Oh, look. Wait. Control. There's control panel. Oh, this operation has been canceled due to restriction effect on the computer. So what happened? Exactly what we thought should happen. Alma is restricted from using the control panel. So let's go ahead and log off. And now let's go ahead and log back in as the Globomantics administrator. Okay, so Globomantics administrator. And first of all, as the administrator, just out of curiosity, let me go ahead and click on start. Oh, look, controls panel's still there, and I can still get to it. Why? Because the administrator, it has nothing to do with the administrator being all powerful. Trust me, I can make this not work for the administrator as well. And matter of fact, that's one of the really interesting things about group policies. You know, you can get crazy with it and actually get yourself locked out and have to work your way out of a corner. But let me go ahead and go back into our Group Policy Management Console. And now for Group Policy Results, I'm going to right click and go to the Group Policy Results wizard. Next, this computer. Now you see I can choose Alma Blanchard. Next, next, and finish. Settings, show all, and if I scroll down, you'll see that Alma was prohibited access to the control panel the last time she went and logged in. Now, just one more thing that I want to do, just to kind of prove to you, so to speak, that it is the group policy object that's causing all this to happen. I'm going to go ahead and expand through here again and go to New York users. And I am going to delete this link. Now you'll notice under group policy objects, disable control panel is still there. It's just not linked to New York users anymore. And if I were to go to group policy modeling and run the group policy modeling wizard, and again, go ahead and browse and put in A Blanchard. And for computer, New York client 1. Actually, I should browse. It's better this way. New York client. Let me check names. Go ahead and pick New York client 1. There we go. All right. Skip to the final page. Next, next, finish. Now, group policy modeling, settings, show all. I scroll down. You'll notice no settings are defined under user configuration. Nowhere in here am I going to find Alma being affected by the disable control panel GPO. So, let me close this. Let's go ahead and log off. Go ahead and log back in. Switch user. A Blanchard. And this time, when Alma logs in, click start, look what's there. Control panel. Okay? So that control panel was eliminated based upon the group policy object. Now, one other thing that I want to mention to you before we wrap this lesson up is I said that we would talk about the controlling of the user's environment from both a locking down as well as making things readily available point of view. And we are going to do that. In the upcoming lessons, we will look at actually making things available for users. Okay, whereas so far, all we've seen is how to lock down. We've seen how to prohibit access to the control panel. Of course, we've also seen that we could have disabled that setting to explicitly grant access to the control panel. And as a matter of fact, you know what? Let's do that real fast. Let me go ahead and click on Start and log off. Let's go ahead and log back in as the Globomantics administrator. And let's go back into Group Policy Management. Because just to show you one last thing here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and at the domain level, so here, globalmantics.local, here's the default domain policy. I'm going to go in there, and in that default domain policy, I'm going to go ahead and expand policies, administrative templates, control panel. Let's enable this setting. Okay, so what we've done is we've made it that we've prohibited access to the control panel pretty much for all users in the globalmantics.local domain. But then I'm going to come down here and I'm going to go to New York users and I'm going to right click and create another GPO and link it here. And I'm going to call this one Enable Control Panel. And then let's go in and edit that. And this time, we're going to go ahead and, for prohibit access to the control panel, let's disable that setting. And go ahead and close the editor. And we're going to actually close out of Group Policy Management, log off, log back in, but this time, let's log in as Alma. Now, let's think about what just happened here. Before we even look at it, let's think about this. Alma logged in, and the local policy says, sure, there's a control panel. Here you go. Then we look to the site. There are no site policies, so nothing happened there. Then we look at the domain, and there's a domain policy that says disable the control panel. So the control panel has been taken away. But then we look through the OU hierarchy and see that Alma's in an OU called New York Users, and there's a GPO linked to that OU, and that GPO enables the control panel. So what should happen? Well, Alma should have access to the control panel. If I click on Start, there it is. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Let me log off. And go ahead and log back in as the globalmantics administrator. Now, the globalmantics administrator goes through the same process, and the local policy says here's the control panel. There is no site policy. The domain policy says eliminate or prohibit access to the control panel, and that's it, because the administrator account is in the default users container, which doesn't have any GPOs on it. So if I click on Start, look what's missing. No more control panel. And down here, if I type in control and try to go to the control panel, look at that. Denied once again. Okay, so you see, it has nothing to do with the fact that I'm an administrator or I'm not an administrator. Group policy settings are group policy settings for everybody. So what I need to do is go into my group policy management utility and go to my default domain policy. And that's not a real good policy that I put in place. It's not a real good idea to say everybody in the domain is prohibited access to the control panel. So let's go ahead and let's get rid of that. Okay, so that's no longer configured. And because we did that, we can also go ahead and actually, I'll tell you what, well, we'll leave it there. We'll take this group policy and we're going to delete the link, but we'll leave the policy. Maybe we'll use that for future use, right? We have two group policy objects we've created, one called disable control panel, one called enable control panel, and that's exactly what these policies do. All right, well, I think that's enough for this lesson. I think I've crammed enough down your throat here when it comes to group policy. Your brain's probably freaking out a little bit. So let's go wrap things up and see what we've learned so far. All right, so in this lesson, we started off by looking at globalmantics needs, which is the needs of most organizations, which is to have control over the user's environment on their individual computers. And that's why we use group policy objects. What is a group policy object? It's a bunch of settings that we then apply to users and or computers. We do this through the Group Policy Management Console. And as you could see, you could either go to a domain controller or you could use the remote server administration tools to get to this utility. And there's quite a bit in this utility. And I will tell you, we have just barely touched upon everything that can be done within group policy. I showed you how to create a GPO, which can either be created without being linked anywhere, or you can create and link a GPO at the same time. I showed you how to link an existing GPO to a container. We talked about LSDOU. And one extra thing I want to talk to you about real quick here when it comes to LSDOU. The one thing I didn't mention, although it was kind of implied by everything that I told you, is that yes, we have this order of application and inheritance. But when it comes to GPOs and linking them, a single container can have more than one GPO linked to it, and a single GPO can be linked to multiple containers. Now, we're going to touch upon this in more detail in the next lesson. I just wanted to give you that quick piece of info in case that was still confusing, because I kind of implied it but didn't clearly state that you have that level of flexibility, and that's why LSDOU and understanding that order of processing is so important. We then went ahead and implemented a policy. Matter of fact, we implemented a couple policies when it came to enabling and disabling control panel. And then we tested the policy, which we can test through a what if statement through the group policy modeling wizard. We can test the policy by actually logging in as a user and seeing what happens. And then once a user logs on, if we don't get the results that we were expecting, we can then test a little bit further, or maybe we'll say troubleshoot a little further, by doing the group policy results wizard to see exactly why certain results took place. All right, well, that brings us to the end of this lesson. Go ahead and grab yourself something to eat, something to drink, give your brain a rest. If you don't need a rest, well, then just pop right into the next lesson, whatever you need to do. But I will look forward to seeing you there.